Yeah, why don't we just go ahead and get started, and if a few more people trickle in, that's fine too. So
Okay.
the floor is all yours.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for being here. My name is Jill Anderson. I am the Humanities Instruction Librarian at Georgia State University. And my presentation today is on meeting them where they are, designing active learning information literacy modules within an LMS. Unusually hard to say. I'm going to be talking about some information literacy modules that I designed within iCollege, which is what GSU uses. And I'm going to walk through this in terms of how my thinking developed about my thinking and my design developed over time. I'm going to start by talking just a tiny bit about GSU Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. It is now the Center for Excellence in Teaching, Learning, and Online Education. At the time, it was just CETL. A 4-week intensive online course that it offered, which got me thinking about iCollege. And then I'm going to talk through 3 different iterations of modules that I designed in various different ways for 3 courses, Philosophy 8980, which was a teaching philosophy practicum, and I co-taught that with another colleague who we'll be talking about a little bit, Religious Studies 4770 and 3700, both focusing on alternative medicine, and Journalism 2500 Foundations of Media Research. All 3 of these courses involved kind of my evolving sense of how to create active learning components within an LMS. And then I'm going to finish with some conclusions and some thoughts about how this worked and how this didn't work. So I'm going to start with Mastering Online Teaching, or the MOT course. This was strongly recommended for all faculty and was offered monthly beginning in, strangely, April 2020 in response to, as we all know, what happened in March 2020. It was strongly recommended for all faculty. It was optional for librarians. Initially, there had been some discussion of should librarians take this class and not take seats that were meant for faculty. However, these were essentially MOOCs, so it wasn't really an issue. As you can see there were about 800 people in my particular section, so I wasn't that worried about taking up space. It was meant to focus on the basics of online teaching more broadly, and for me, the most useful part was the basics of teaching with iCollege. It was aimed at faculty. The assignment was to construct at least one full module for a particular course, so it was meant to help faculty redesign their courses, and there was an extremely heavy emphasis on assessment and grading, which was not as useful to me, especially the part about the grading. Lots of grading, oh so very much grading. But this did give me some ideas, and I'm going to talk here for a minute just about how I like to teach. This is a pattern that I've sort of developed, particularly in relationship with a particular faculty member that I worked with, Marnie Davis, in the history department, and I have taught not an online, an in-person footnote mining exercise, which I'm happy to share with people at the end of this when I can put links into the chat, on following the footnote, which actually has students follow the footnotes from materials that they've already read for class. It's highly interactive, and the pattern we usually follow was that there'd be some instruction and a little demonstration on my part, how to search, how to look things up, followed by guided practice, which is meant to be very low stakes. We usually would break the students into small groups. The students would have the opportunity to practice what I had just taught them. The instructor and I float and respond to questions, preferably in small groups, which allowed for some peer collaboration, and then a general thing where everybody reports in, all the groups report in, so that everyone can learn from individuals or groups' questions. Every stuck moment, we tell them you're going to have questions. Every little stuck moment becomes a teaching moment that then everybody can learn from. And importantly, like I said, not graded, low stakes. Tend not to assess these very heavily because my point is more like helping them get over the hurdles and then making sure everybody learns from what those hurdles are. I think of this, the reason I have Cookie Monster dancing here is that this is a pattern that I use a lot, and I think of it as being sort of like one recipe with endless variations. You can do all kinds of different things with this pattern, but that is my favorite pattern to teach from, and the issue for me was, well, how do I go from this to online teaching? And what really stood out for me in taking the online teaching course, though I would say I don't think you need to take a course for this, there were plenty of online tutorial materials, and my teaching partner, Kevin, was actually able to use this to learn, was for me the most important part was the discussion of formative assessments. I'm not going to read that giant block of text, but the scaffolding, and for me, it started to strike me as that these formative assessment techniques, the discussion forums, the quizzes, and the surveys could also be techniques for facilitating student participation. And the next step was sort of, how do I do this? And why iCollege? This is just me sort of embracing the LMS. Usually we had said to faculty, you can add a librarian to your LMS and they can put in a LibGuide or they can monitor a discussion or something. And this was actually designing instruction within iCollege. I know another session I was in earlier today used Padlet, and I was aware of third-party tools. But because the faculty and students and me were overwhelmed by the learning curve, we have here live footage of academia in spring 2020. By that learning curve involved in moving everything online and in learning iCollege, I made the decision, and you'll see with the next class I talked about, this was a joint decision, to meet them where they were and to not ask them to learn even more new technology or platforms because the faculty I talked with were already kind of at like, wow, they looked like done music. And also because faculty could easily add me into their course iCollege's pages. And having been able, I realized also that I could set up a sandbox, design the module there, and easily import it into a course page. So it was sort of not exactly seamless, but it was something that didn't ask a whole lot more of faculty and students. It did involve a learning curve for me, but that was okay. So the first iteration I'm going to talk about, there he is banging his, I'll never get it, never, never, never. And we eventually did. Was the Philosophy 8980 Teaching Philosophy Practicum. And this, although he is not here attending with me, this was something that I developed in partnership with our popular music and culture archivist, Kevin Fleming. And he and I have taught multiple active learning teaching with primary sources sessions. And we had a history with Philosophy's graduate pedagogy program, and that we had already taught a teaching with primary sources collection. And in late 2019, we were asked to do a second session on teaching with primary sources in summer 2020 as the philosophy students were getting ready to start teaching their own undergraduate courses to do something more on primary sources as ways of critiquing argument structures. Philosophy. Whoops. And coronavirus meant that we had to turn our planned session into, it was going to be on the Comics Code, into an online session, and Bert's face is how we looked. So we decided together that we would create an iCollege module, and we requested a sandbox, not quite that intensive of a sandbox, but close enough. And I had this basic introduction to iCollege from the MOT course. Kevin used online tutorials and also the help desk to learn his way into basic iCollege use. Both of those worked. I'm not sure I needed the full on 4-week class for it, but both of those ways worked as ways of learning our way into the LMS. And we got fancy. We wanted to include a combination of asynchronous components, which we hoped the students would engage with both before and after our synchronous session, and then a lesson plan for the synchronous session. And this is the outline of our lesson plan. We had one exercise, the first one that was asynchronous, where we asked them to read an article beforehand. And this was Frederick Wortham, if you're at all familiar with the history of the comic code. This is the man who thought comic books were rooting young people's minds. He had very strong feelings about it, so the argument was pretty clear. We wanted them to read the article beforehand and respond to questions in an iCollege discussion forum that we set up. And these were basically interpretive questions and all, what is he arguing? What is he, et cetera. We then plan to have it within the synchronous session, a discussion of that article, building on the responses in the forum. We meant for that to be inclusive, that if people were not comfortable talking in class, that they could have typed their responses into the discussion forum. These were about to be teachers. We assumed they'd be comfortable talking, but be mindful of that. Then they were going to view another comic panel panel online and discuss using more questions that we gave them, which we're going to build on exercise 1, essentially comparing ideas from this about that argument to the article that they had read. And then afterwards, we had asked them to try searching for primary sources on their own and report their findings in their discussion homework section, and then complete an evaluation. Best laid plans. As it turned out, the students did not do any of the asynchronous components. And that was a learning process for us. Luckily, we had striking visual images that we were using. This on the left is the article that we had them read. And so we had to do some fast thinking, which, by the way, is challenging to do in an online format, especially with a partner. And we had them actually interpret the various visual components of the Wortham article. They got very interested in that he was identified as an MD. They got very interested in that this is Ladies' Home Journal. They went off into an interesting tangent about how they couldn't take him seriously because he had published in Ladies' Home Journal, which for myself, I'm interested in women's and girls' magazines, was interesting, and something that I had to draw them out on a little bit more. And then over on the right is the comic that we planned to have them read in class. So we were able to lead that discussion, but we weren't able to do them as much comparative work. But definitely recommend striking visual images. In a pinch, you can ask students to interact with it, to engage with those. And we were able to kind of work around the lab asynchronous stuff. The lessons that we learned were that the synchronous instruction was effective. For the asynchronous components, we learned that we needed more buy-in from the professor to incentivize students to complete readings and to help and to get them to participate in those online forums. In other words, we needed help with flipping the class. And we also needed help with encouraging the students to complete the evaluation questions. We also learned that co-teaching is difficult in an online platform. We did need to think on our feet with the not asynchronous materials not being engaged with. In person, Kevin Fleming and I are great at thinking on our feet together. Online, it was really hard to figure out which box he was in, and we couldn't make eye contact or communicate privately. So we made it work, but it was a learning experience in terms of what co-teaching is like. And here is Swedish Chef failing to flip. So the second iteration was Professor Claire Van Holm in the Religious Studies Department, and she taught over 2 semesters, 2 courses on complementary and alternative medicine. Religion and health was the same theme. It's not as obvious from the title. And she got in touch with me, and we had some really interesting conversations about what she'd like to do. And I'd been able, was able to say I've sort of done a little work with iCollege, and she was very up for that. What she wanted was something entirely asynchronous. She wanted a series of short videos explaining various tasks or skills that she wanted them to do towards an assignment. So this was scaffolding. She was excited about the opportunity for students to practice skills after watching the videos. We had to kind of think about, again, this interactivity activity. And we also realized that creating some sort of discussion forum also gave opportunities for myself and Professor Van Holm to respond to students' practice. So it isn't the same as us floating, but if they type their responses and their questions, et cetera, into a discussion forum, then we were able to go in and answer and to see, do we need more instruction on this? Maybe this person needs to be sent directly to Jill. We had more opportunities for this. And because each course had about 25 students, we decided to use the discussion forums. And the cool thing about this, I loved this, and I want to continue to do this, and this was Professor Van Holm's idea, what she wanted for those recordings was not just kind of a recording of me talking, giving a tutorial, but she wanted it to be more approachable, and she wanted it to be a recording of me teaching her. So both of us were on the video, and I was teaching her, which was wonderful because it let me, I'm fairly extroverted, it let me not feel like I was just talking to a machine, but it also allowed us to customize as we went, because she would chime in and say, oh yeah, maybe they need to know this. And so they're very much more sort of, they don't feel as canned. They kind of feel like a recording of a conversation. We managed to give them about 10 minutes each, so it worked out really well. And the videos recorded for her particular needs, one was on brainstorming keywords, one was on searching the Atla Religion database, One was on searching in Alt Health Watch, which was interesting because she very much wanted them to find articles about sociocultural meanings. They each had to choose a particular traditional or alternative medicine procedure process and then research it. And she wanted them not to look for does it work, but she wanted to look more for things about sociocultural meaning, religious meaning, spiritual meaning. And she wanted them to see what it looked like to search for that in a health sciences database. So we did that. And then the fourth one was on searching for reliable sources online, which, as you can imagine, for alternative medicine, that's an important skill for them to learn. And I'm not going to read through these, but these are in this case, these are the questions that we did, the 4 questions, the 4 discussion forums. These are the questions. So you can see this was almost like conducting a reference interview within the discussion forum. And these were the questions that I asked. And I also included some basic written instruction. I know personally myself, I am not good at learning from videos. I do need written instruction, and so I wanted to also provide some written instruction within the body of the discussion forums so that the students could see that and have that as a refresher. So one on brainstorming keywords, and by asking these questions, I'm also helping them move forward with their topic. What is your question, and what are some keywords? They don't have to know the keywords at that point. Just what are your starting points? So here are the questions for trying the keywords in ATLA, trying the same keywords in Alt Health Watch and seeing, were they different? Did you find sociocultural? And searching for reliable online sources. And one thing I wanted them to think about was try looking up the organization whose site this is in Wikipedia so that they're not just trusting the About page. And so for the next time, Professor Horn taught that, like I said, there were 2 courses, and she taught a very similar course during the spring semester, and she basically reused the module. We didn't change it that much. She had also hoped for more embedding. She wanted students to meet with me. We talked about that a little bit more in advance in the spring class, but only a handful of students sought me out during the fall course, and none did in the spring. So when I had said earlier, buy-in from the professor, even with this urging and buy-in from the professor, the students still were not quite engaging as way we wanted. There was always the possibility of adding. And now it's summer 2021. We're looking towards fall 2021, where we're going to go back to a little bit more in person. We're not quite sure. I'm starting to think about ways of translating what I've done within the iCollege modules like this. What to keep, what to change, what to play with. I'm imagining going back to my earlier model, sort of worksheets and in-session searching with floating, but I'm also thinking about flipping and asking the students to view those videos prior to the class session so that there's more time in the class for the hands-on practice and for the reporting in, and possibly also continuing to use the iCollege for embedding, for scheduling, for continued back and forth, and who knows, for other components that might seem appropriate as the instructor deems necessary. And then the third and last one I'm going to talk about is, of course, Journalism 2500 Foundations of Media Research, which is the research methods course for the journalism department. And I've taught, this is a class that I had taught in person a couple of times for Professor Douglas Barthlow. So this was, again, sort of how do we do, what do we do, how are we going to do this? And in this case, the ask was, again, recording, all asynchronous instructions, recorded videos, and this was just myself talking. One recording on how to search in communication and mass media complete, and he wanted something on reference mining. I had talked that up, and he was excited about it and wanted to leave that up to me for how I would do that. Because the courses were large, there were 60 students in each class and 2 courses, we decided not to use discussion forums because that was going to be a lot. We decided to use quizzes. My own background is in American Studies, and I tend not to be all that excited about multiple choice quizzes, but in this case, obviously, in terms of grading, that was the way we would want to go. He also wanted me to focus on articles by or about a particular venerable scholar, Klaus Krippendorf. I will say here, I did record the videos and I did have to do a lot of captioning editing. There are multiple, you would be amazed at the multiple ways that it is possible to completely misspell Klaus Krippendorf if you are an automatic captioning source. So these were kind of the parameters that I was working within. And the result would be the students would watch the videos and then take multiple choice quizzes. And this, I should add here that Professor Bartholow and I also had a conversation because I had so liked the model of working with Claire Van Horn where it was more informal. It wasn't kind of like a canned tutorial. I asked, would it be all right if I recorded the session more as if I were teaching? And he had seen me teach before. He likes how I teach, rather than making it into sort of a canned, very formal tutorial. And he was fine with that. Do what you need to do. You're a great teacher. He didn't say it quite that way, but I mean, he likes my teaching and was comfortable with having it be more informal. Because for me, again, I want to seem approachable and not perfect, if that makes sense. So the students were going to watch the videos and then take multiple choice quizzes, testing their knowledge. And so the challenge there was coming up with quizzes. And we could then use the more gradable option, the multiple choice quizzes, and then kind of assess areas that might need further instruction. So the design was pretty straightforward for the search for articles component. This is sort of what it looked like. This isn't broken out, obviously, but there was how to search for articles and then a quiz that sort of went over some of the basic stuff that I had taught in that video. The challenge, and this is, Grover is demonstrating how I felt through much of this, was the limitation to Klaus Krippendorff. And I learned a lot doing this. Dr. Krippendorff's work is highly interdisciplinary, and so it extended well beyond communication and mass media complete as a database. He also cited a fair amount of older works, which I'm a historian, there's nothing wrong with that, but the link resolver was not happy, and every time it connected with JSTOR, I would literally get every result from a journal given in the citation. So instead of getting my article that Mr. Krippendorff had cited, I would get a list of 12,000 articles, and I was like, I do not want to teach that to students. So my idea was then, okay, let me screenshot a works cited list from an article by Krippendorff and have them try looking up the items. But because of the older works and the interdisciplinary, I couldn't find an article that lent itself to this without a lot of challenges. And for the footnote, for the reference mining, you want a little friction. You want the students to need to work a little bit, but you don't want total frustration. And that's what this would have amounted in, especially because I wouldn't be there in person to float and help. So, like Grover, I was stumbling a lot. What ended up happening was that I created an instructional video on reference mining, which focused on how to recognize APA citation format communication for multiple items, for a book, for an article, for a book chapter. And then the next step was how to find that article using Advanced Discover, so the advanced version, the advanced search option in our discovery system, because of the interdisciplinary, and it wasn't always clear what discipline he was actually writing in. So the discovery system came to the rescue on that. And then the quiz that I gave them, you can see an example of this, was identifying parts of canned APA citations. And these were all publications of Dr. Krippendorff's. There was one that was a book, there was one that was an article, and there was one that was a book chapter. The result of that was we did see some confusion between articles and book chapters, which was totally understandable. I actually do see that a lot in student requests, so gave me some information for the next time to continue to pull that out a little bit and to explain the similarities and the differences. But generally, the students did pretty well on the quizzes. I didn't see any, there were no major failures. They generally 80–90% got it right. In this case, Professor Bartholow, there was actual assessment. The previous time I had attempted to do assessment, the students didn't fill it out, as we've all experienced. Professor Bartholow gave his students a mid-semester survey within iCollege to assess how the course was going, and this included, kindly of him, several questions about my instruction, and the responses were generally pretty positive. There were one or two comments on areas of improvement. The videos were too long. Indeed, they were. And I talk too fast. Indeed, I do. But at least one student wrote very appreciatively about that I had discussed several things not to do as well as to do. And in other words, I talked a lot about don't click full text in a database that turns off our link resolver. Generally, they were very appreciative, and I now have a sheet full of happy, helped, mostly appreciative, happy, feeling helped comments for my next year's evaluation as a result of this. So in this case, but again, that was faculty buy-in. I needed his support to have that done. So for the next time for Professor Barthelow's class, I'll be redoing the videos. They'll be recorded in shorter chunks and with a little more scaffolding in between them. The in-class demo, as a result, I think can be shorter and can be more targeted to course needs if they've been able to watch the videos prior to class. I still like the idea of playing with multiple choice and maybe even discussion forums, depending on the side of the class, because then again, I can tailor things as I'm going. The shorter searching demo allows for more time, that should be time, not tie, for trying out that in-person reference mining exercise, and possibly being able to expand beyond the works of Klaus Krippendorf. But I did feel like in-person would have made that a less challenging parameter, just because I would have been there to help. I still would have had to do a pretty strong amount of vetting to identify something useful, but I think there are ways to incorporate the components that I designed and the questions and the discussion forums and quizzes into redoing this. And I'm assuming I'll be doing this again in the fall. So conclusions about iCollege, as we've probably all seen, there's probably kind of going to be a difference between emergency online instruction, what we saw in March and the summer, and to a certain extent even in the fall, which for me again involved meeting the faculty and students where they were, trying not to increase their sort of technological load as they were doing this. Collaborating with faculty, and again, my awesome archivist colleague, on creative ways of reworking and facilitating active learning within a platform that was already being used for instruction. So again, not asking, the philosophy professor we were working with was actually about to retire when this happened. And we really didn't want to, it was enough for her to have to figure out the iCollege and the microphone and all. We also, though, campus-wide heard reports of student complaints about too many formative assessment assignments, even though the online teaching course had told the faculty to do that. Students were complaining that there were too many of these and that they were perceived as busy work, so you want to be kind of mindful of that. Going forward, I do expect that I'm going to continue to work more actively like this within iCollege, within the LMS. I want to be mindful of those student concerns and make sure that everything I'm doing feels like real scaffolding, real instruction, things that will really help them with their projects. And I think the work that I did, especially with Professor Van Horn and Professor Bartholow, because I was so much in conversation with both of those professors, I think what I did met that concern. I also see using iCollege more and more for classroom flipping for my own instruction, being able to work with the faculty, being able to be added in, being able to create videos, or more, and as well as more interactive activities. I think that's something that can be used, and it's something that I'm looking forward to working more creative with going forward. Always in conversation with the faculty. Bigger conclusions then. One thing I want to say, and I want to go back to this because I think this is important. I took a formal course which involved learning iCollege, but that wasn't the whole focus of the course. Kevin, my instructional partner, used online tutorials and used GSU, his help desk features when he had questions. My conclusion would be you don't need a formal course. You can learn your way into that LMS. I know my university had really extensive online tutorials. Yours may as well. Be prepared to ask for help because it's not super intuitive. I think either way would work. I personally found the formal course to be kind of creatively limiting. I came out of it feeling a little twitchy about best practices, and somebody earlier today said a great thing about good practices as opposed to best practices. Put onto him, he was able to be a little more flexible, and I was able to follow his lead with that. Within an LMS, I do think active learning is possible, and I think there's lots of interesting ways to be creative with it that I have not thought of yet or covered in this presentation. But I will say, and I think this is extremely important, asynchronous active learning absolutely required faculty support and conversation, and most importantly, incentivization. We could not get students to do. Like for the philosophy course, we couldn't, us as librarians alone, we could not get the students to do the asynchronous work. Collaboration with faculty is key. And with the other two faculty, I will say in fairness, also reported that even with incentivization with this online instruction, not all students completed the faculty designed asynchronous components. Again, this reports of frustration and stuff. So I didn't feel like, oh, Kevin and I did something wrong. It felt like this is an issue with online instruction. How do you incentivize asynchronous instruction? What do you do in our case when they haven't done it? You have to be a little flexible to be able to work around students having not done it. Very similar to when I was a professor and I would have students come to class having not done the reading, and you learn techniques like bringing in an image for them to analyze. You learn techniques. I realize that you also have to do that with the online instruction. And finally, I think a really important and interesting thing was that within the LMS, you can import modules from one course to another. And once I was able to figure out how to do that, that meant that I and Kevin and I could draft modules and easily share those with instructors once they'd added me to the course. So this was sort of taking it beyond just embedding, being there, reading the discussion forums and helping, to being able to do active instructional design in conversation with the faculty, but also that sandbox, buried in the sand, that sandbox was actually a really fantastic way to have me do the learning behind the scenes without having to have the faculty watch me learn it. But it also meant that it was really pretty easy to import things back and forth. So I have my own little sandbox iCollege thing that I can use to try out all kinds of stuff. And then I can also easily share it with faculty once they've added me to their course. They can see what I've done, and then if they like it, we can fiddle with it, and it's already in their course. So those are my general conclusions. You will probably agree with my students that I talk too quickly, but I'm going to stop and see if there are questions. And I'm going to close this, if that's okay, so I can see comments and stuff.
So if you guys have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A and we'll get some answers for you. I had a question. Did you naturally, or did you spend time beforehand over the course of your career kind of developing relationships, or to get them to do this, did you have to work with faculty? Because I know myself, I have a really hard time getting them to trust me, even though they've known me for years, and they'll call me when they need me.
Yeah.
I know I'm not an idiot, but so I guess, was it something like, how'd you get them to trust you? I guess is what I'm
that's a great question. And I should say, I have worked at GSU as a liaison librarian for 11 years now. And when I started, I support 5 departments right now, and they're all have really long names. I'm Africana Studies, Communication, Philosophy, Religious Studies, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And when I started, I was the history librarian, and I have a PhD in history. And what you're describing, having trouble getting them to trust you, I almost had the problem of like, oh my Lord, could you trust me less? Because there was so much teaching they had me do. So I didn't actually have the experience of like needing to like, please let me teach for you. After a while, we had to actually back up and streamline it a little bit because I was doing so much teaching that the majors had seen me like 5 times. And it just wasn't like, and please, and the students would tell, the faculty would tell the students that I knew all of the history ever, which was like, you guys all have PhDs, that's not the case. So I was like, do you know? What exactly do you think happens in library school? So I had that experience, and for me, what's been interesting is because I've done a lot of teaching as a librarian, once I dropped that department and started picking up other departments, I kind of had a certain, I don't want to say brashness, but I went to faculty meetings when I first started with a new department and kind of said, here's what I like to do. The work with Marnie Davis, the footnote binding exercise, which I'm probably, if I can figure out how to do that, I'll put that in the chat. That was actually a really good experience because that built a long time partnership, and I sort of learned how to partner with faculty through that. And I've also had an experience of teaching. I've taught a credit for credit honors course, and that also gave me kind of a laboratory thing. So I tend in my emails to faculty about, hey, it's time to think about teaching. I tend to be like, I can do this for you, and I can do this for you, and I can do this for you. And sometimes they take me up on it. Sometimes they don't. The ones who do take me up, there's often word of mouth. But I've tried to be sort of also assertive. One thing I learned from all of the history teachers the situation is that if I target the research methods courses, those were like the best ones to start with. But I do tend to focus on relationship building and like going to events in their department, making myself visible, that kind of thing. And once I have one department that hardly ever asks me for teaching. I have one department that's asked me for maybe like 2 classes in a whole year. So, as we all know, it's kind of hit or miss. In this case, with these online things, when we first got sent home in March, I was really afraid no one was ever going to ask me to teach for them again. Doug I had taught for previously, and so I was a known quantity to him, and he was kind of like, can you do what you did for my in-class class, for my online class? And Claire got in touch with me through her department chair, Molly Bassett, who is awesome, and I've done a bunch of teaching for Molly. That's my newest department, and they have been very, yay, we want someone to teach. In terms of trusting me, I don't have a good answer for that. I just keep sort of trying to. One of the hard things for me about working from home is that if you're at all familiar with the Georgia State campus, it's a lot of skyscrapers, and most of my departments are in the same building. And I miss running into people in elevators and being able to say, like, hey, let's do this. But sorry, that's a really long answer. But
no, that's all right.
It's a really tough question, isn't it? Like, how do you get them to trust you?
Yes. And I don't think anybody can really give like a tangible, like, this is how you do it.
No, I mean, so much is just kind of like, and in my case, it was so weird with the history department because, the normal problem is how do we get people to do this? And, I was kind of like, how do I get them to back off?
Leave me alone.
Yeah. People would be like, well, no, that's a good problem. And I'd be like, no, it isn't, because there's no literature on it. Like, no one writes about this kind of aspect of it. But I did learn some things from that. But I also at the time kind of felt like, wow. The guy who introduced me is the embodiment of all of the historical knowledge in the building. It's like, I have to be like, no. No. I can teach you how to find stuff, but I don't know where it all is. So I'm seeing a question here. Marianne,
oh, good.
Did they assign any of them? Actually, with the first case, with the philosophy class, no. And that was a big reason why that was a learning moment for us, was like, we have to have the professor assigning stuff because they just didn't do any of it. In the second and third cases with the religious studies course and the journalism course, yes. And it kind of felt like, because it was fall 2020 and spring 2021, they had also learned that they needed to assign things and incentivize them that way, if that makes sense. I mean, this was a learning curve for everybody. And I think I did mention to Professor Van Horn, can you incentivize this? Molly did the same thing in her class, and I kind of had to ask, can you do something with this? One of the things I have liked about being a librarian as opposed to being a professor is not grading, so that made me a little sad. But in the second, with the religion classes and the journalism classes, Marianne, yes, they did assign them. And even with that, we still found that the students were not completing. More of them were, the percentage definitely went up, but still, students were still not completing the asynchronous stuff. So it didn't feel like it was, they're a librarian, I don't have to. It felt like we just, people struggling with time management and all kinds of other pandemic-related issues. Other questions? I do think, just to go back to the question about trust, it has been harder to get people to, I mean, people I normally teach for have not asked me for instruction, and I am not sure. I'm curious to see what's going to happen in fall. I don't know if it's a matter of trust or the newness of everything, or people just sort of trying to get through and not wanting to add to their load. But I mean, I have seen my numbers drop a little bit, and I mean, again, I'm not sure what to do about that either. I'm not sure how to convey, do I send, here's an example of a video I did, I can do this for you. It's like, I'm still trying, I think we're all trying to figure that out, and this is such a weird time.
Yeah, it is. It threw a wrench in like some of my plans. And I'm sure it did with many of y'all.
Yeah. I would be surprised if there are people who didn't feel wrench in the plans.
Like, oh man, I'm gonna have to rethink this now.
Yeah. And interesting for me too, I don't learn well from videos, and I had one professor email me very, very early on in like April saying like, well, why don't you just record a 5-minute video with everything students need to know about researching philosophy, and then we'll just put it in our SharePoint and use it instead of having you teach from us. And like, you didn't need to see this, but at home I looked at this and I burst into tears because it was like, but I want to keep my job.
Right.
But I don't think I can do 5 minutes, everything they need to know in 5. It's like, do you really think I can do, my teaching can be replaced by a 5-minute video? So, I mean, I did not do that, but that kind of threw me. And then looking back, retroactively now, that was April when everybody was losing their mind. So. Other questions? I am, if anybody's interested, I can put the article that we wrote about the footnote mining exercise, because that's actually a very hands-on how-to thing, and it's a great exercise to do with history faculty or just with anybody. And is there interest in that? Should I do that?
Yeah, because I kind of want to see it.
It is open access, so you don't have to.
Can they summarize all of U.S. history in 5 minutes? I don't think so.
Yeah. I always wanted to say, like, I have one PhD. I don't have all the PhDs. Yeah, can I summarize? Why just U.S. history? Why not world history in 5 minutes? Did that show up? Can they No, Marianne. All of U.S. history. I can think of some keywords. Slavery, but yeah. Anything else? Anybody else have any questions?
Well, thank you very much for presenting and sharing your work with us. We really appreciate it, and I learned definitely a lot. It was a very interesting presentation you gave. So
thank you all for coming.
Thank you.